The rocking chair sat empty on the porch, its worn oak runners catching morning light like old bones remembering dance. Samuel Hawkins stood frozen before it, rough hands gripping the doorframe while his daughters waited by the wagon, their small voices carrying across Wyoming's vast silence. "Papa," Ruth called softly. "We placed Mama's flowers." 2 years since Mary's fever took her. 2 years of that chair holding only shadow and memory. Samuel forced himself to turn away, boots heavy on the warped planks as he descended toward his girls, 11 and 9, too young for such practiced quiet. The wagon wheels groaned their familiar complaint as they rolled toward Copper Creek. 15 miles of rutted trail between their homestead and civilization's dubious comfort. Grace hummed their mother's hymn while Ruth held the supply list, Mary's careful script still visible on yellowed paper. Neither girl noticed their father's knuckles, white against the reins. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The streets of Copper Creek pressed in closer than Samuel remembered, thick with bodies and buzzing with the peculiar energy that meant trouble or spectacle. In frontier towns, often the same thing. He guided the wagon carefully through the throng. Ruth and Grace pressed against his sides like small birds sensing a storm. "Stay close," he murmured, though his daughters needed no warning. Their hands found his coat sleeves as naturally as roots find water. Hopkins, the store clerk, stood outside the mercantile wringing his hands like laundry. His face, usually ruddy with good humor, had gone the color of old ash. "Mr. Hawkins," he called out, voice pitched high with nervousness. "Might want to. That is, there's a situation in the square. Judge Thornton's conducting some business." Samuel nodded, intending to steer clear of whatever frontier justice was being dispensed. He'd seen enough of men's cruelty in the war to last several lifetimes. But the crowd was thick as molasses, forcing them toward the square despite his efforts. Then he saw her. The woman stood in the center of the square, wrists bound before her, chin raised with a dignity that made the ropes seem like decoration rather than restraint. Her dress, though dusty, was pressed neat as Sunday service. Dark hair pulled back severe, revealing a face that might have been carved from prairie stone, all angles and stubborn grace. Judge Thornton, pompous as a turkey cock in his imported vest, was mid-proclamation, husband found dead, and this woman, this deaf and dumb creature, the only suspect. The law says she hangs, but Christian mercy offers alternative. Any man willing to take responsibility for her. The words faded to buzzing as Samuel felt both his daughters stiffen. Their small hands gripped his arms with sudden, electric recognition. "Papa," Ruth whispered, her voice carrying that peculiar certainty children possess when adults are being foolish. "That's her. That's the lady." Grace's voice came softer, but no less sure. "The deaf woman who helped us. At the harvest fair, when we were lost." The memory crashed through Samuel like spring flood through a dam. 3 years back, the girls had wandered off at the autumn fair, swallowed by the crowd while he'd been negotiating grain prices. Hours of panic, searching, calling their names until his throat went raw. Then this woman, this same woman, had appeared at his elbow, leading his daughters by their hands. She'd smiled, pointed to her ears and shook her head, then gestured eloquently how she'd found them crying by the pie contest and recognized them from seeing them with him earlier. He'd barely thanked her properly, too overwhelmed with relief to do more than grip her hands and nod like a fool while the girls clung to his legs. Now she stood accused of murder, offered up like livestock to any man who'd claim her. Samuel's breathing changed, deep and slow like before a cavalry charge. His daughters felt it too, their grips loosening as they sensed the shift in their father from observer to participant. The crowd around them murmured and shifted, men looking at their boots rather than meet the woman's steady gaze. The judge's offer hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, acrid and unwanted. The memory wouldn't release him. Samuel could see it clear as yesterday. Clara, yes. That had been her name. The shopkeeper's wife had mentioned it kneeling before his lost daughters, her hands moving in gentle, graceful patterns that somehow communicated safety without a single word. The girls had understood her immediately, that mysterious way children comprehend kindness regardless of language. She'd given them each a piece of penny candy from her pocket while leading them through the fair, scanning the crowd with sharp, intelligent eyes until she'd spotted him. The gratitude he'd felt then crashed against the injustice before him now, like two rivers meeting. Judge Thornton's voice cut through his thoughts. "Come now. Surely someone will show Christian charity. The woman needs a guardian, someone to take responsibility. Otherwise, the law demands." Samuel's feet moved before his mind caught up. His worn cavalry hat came off his head, fingers crushing the felt brim as he stepped through the crowd, bodies parted like tall grass, whispers following in his wake. "I'll take responsibility for her." The words rang across the square with the clarity of a church bell. Judge Thornton's mouth opened and closed like a landed trout, his prepared speech scattered to the wind. "You." The judge's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. "Samuel Hawkins. But that is, you have daughters to consider." "My daughters remember her kindness when they were lost and frightened," Samuel said, his voice steady as fence posts. "They'd think less of me if I didn't return that kindness now." He felt Ruth and Grace step up beside him, their small forms straight and proud. Ruth's chin lifted in a mirror of Clara's dignified posture. The crowd's murmur grew to a rumble. Samuel heard fragments. Widower himself. "Those poor girls." "Barely speaks to anyone." Judge Thornton's face flushed red as autumn maple. "This is highly irregular. What do you know of this woman? She's been accused of murdering her own husband." "Accused," Samuel repeated, letting the word hang. "Not proven. And I know she showed mercy to two frightened children with no thought of reward. That tells me more about her character than any accusation." Clara's eyes found his across the square. Recognition flickered there, followed by something that might have been hope or disbelief. Her bound hands lifted slightly, fingers moving in what he somehow understood as a question. "You're certain about this?" Judge Thornton pulled out a handkerchief to mop his forehead despite the morning's coolness. "There are conditions, legal requirements. She must remain under your supervision. Any wrongdoing and you'll share her punishment." "I understand." "And there's the matter of propriety. A single man with a woman, not his wife." "She'll have proper accommodation," Samuel said firmly. "Separate quarters. My daughters will benefit from another woman's presence in their education." The judge looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. The crowd pressed closer, eager for drama or scandal. Sheriff Morrison pushed through, his star glinting in the morning sun. "Well then," Thornton said, producing a leather-bound ledger from his coat. "If you're determined in this foolishness, we'll need to make it legal." As the judge scratched out the necessary documentation, Samuel walked to Clara. Up close, he could see the red marks where the rope had chafed her wrists, the dust on her dark dress, the way her shoulders held themselves square despite what must have been hours of public humiliation. He reached for the ropes, his pocket knife making quick work of them. Clara's hands dropped free, and she rubbed her wrist slowly, eyes never leaving his face. Her mouth moved carefully, forming words he could read. "Thank you." "My daughters recognized you," he said, speaking slowly and clearly so she could read his lips. "From the harvest fair. You helped them." Her face transformed with understanding, eyes flicking to Ruth and Grace. A smile, the first he'd seen from her, broke across her features like sunrise over prairie. She knelt, just as she had 3 years ago, and signed something to the girls. Grace laughed, bright and sudden in the tense square. "She remembers us. She says we've grown tall as corn." The crowd's hostility wavered, faced with a child's laughter. Judge Thornton finished his documentation with angry flourishes. It's done then, he announced to the square. This woman is now the legal responsibility of Samuel Hawkins. Any crime she commits reflect upon him. Any debts she owes transfer to him. May God have mercy on your foolishness. Hawkins. Samuel signed where indicated, his signature firm and clear. When he looked up, half the town was staring at him like he'd grown a second head. The other half was already turning away, the spectacle less interesting now that blood wouldn't be spilled. Come, he said to Clara, gesturing toward the wagon. Let's go home. She stood slowly, dignity intact despite everything. As they walked through the parting crowd, Samuel heard Ruth whisper to Grace, "Papa did the right thing." "I know," Grace whispered back. "Mama would be proud." The words settled in Samuel's chest like a warm stone. He helped Clara onto the wagon seat, his daughters climbing up beside her without hesitation. As he took up the reins, he caught Sheriff Morrison's eye. "You've taken on quite a burden, Hawkins," the sheriff said quietly. Samuel looked at Clara, who was showing Grace how to sign something with her fingers, both of them almost smiling. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps I've finally started paying an old debt." He clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled forward, leaving the square and its judgment behind. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning's chill. The road home stretched ahead, familiar yet somehow completely new. Clara touched his sleeve gently, raised her hands to sign something, then seemed to remember he wouldn't understand. Instead, she pointed to herself, then to the girls, then pressed her hand to her heart. He understood that perfectly. The wagon rolled on. 4 people who'd been strangers an hour ago now bound by law, necessity, and perhaps something more. The empty chair on the porch waited at home, but somehow it didn't seem as daunting now. Samuel allowed himself to wonder, for the first time in 2 years, if emptiness was just another word for possibility. Behind them, Copper Creek resumed its business, the crowd dispersing like smoke. Judge Thornton stood alone in the square, ledger under his arm, watching the wagon disappear into the distance with an expression that promised this wasn't over. But for now. Samuel drove toward home, his daughters chattering excitedly with their hands, learning a new language from a woman who'd been saved by an old kindness returned. The morning had begun with empty chairs and ended with unexpected hope. The horses knew the way home. Samuel let them lead while he watched his daughters' animated faces, their small hands moving in patterns he'd need to learn. Clara caught him watching and offered that sunrise smile again, and he found himself thinking that perhaps salvation came in forms nobody expected. The prairie stretched endless around them, but the wagon felt less lonely than it had in 2 years. Ruth began humming their mother's hymn again, and this time, Samuel found himself humming along. The 15 miles home had never felt longer. Clara sat between Ruth and Grace on the wagon bench, her hands folded carefully in her lap, occasionally signing something simple that made the girls giggle. Samuel kept his eyes on the rutted trail, acutely aware of every shift in weight as the wagon rolled over stones and through dried creek beds. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it carried weight, like the air before a thunderstorm, full of possibility and uncertainty. When the homestead finally came into view, Samuel saw it through a stranger's eyes. The cabin looked smaller than he remembered, weathered gray boards in need of oil, the garden fence listing where winter had pushed it aside. Mary's flowers grew wild around the porch, untended for 2 seasons. The empty rocking chair sat like an accusation. Clara's sharp intake of breath made him turn. She was studying the homestead with those intelligent eyes, taking inventory. Her gaze lingered on the overgrown garden, the washing line with only 3 sets of clothes, the absence of chickens in what was clearly once a coop. When she looked at him, he saw understanding there. This was a household in survival, not living. "Your room," Samuel said carefully, ensuring she could see his lips. "Will be in the barn loft. It's clean and dry. I'll make it proper." She nodded, no offense in her expression. Her hands moved, and Ruth translated eagerly. She says thank you. She says she doesn't want to cause trouble. Samuel climbed down from the wagon, helped his daughters down, then offered his hand to Clara. She hesitated only a moment before accepting, her fingers calloused from work but gentle in their touch. As her feet found the ground, she swayed slightly, exhaustion from standing bound in the square catching up. Grace immediately pressed against her side, steadying her with the instinctive kindness children possess. The barn loft was dusty but sound. Samuel hauled up fresh straw while the girls helped Clara sweep. Within an hour, they'd created a small but dignified space, a proper tick mattress stuffed with clean straw. Mary's old quilt he pushed down the pang at seeing it leave the trunk, a wash basin, and a small table with a coal oil lamp. Clara's eyes filled when Ruth and Grace presented her with one of Mary's dresses, a practical blue calico that had been folded away with lavender. She signed something rapidly, emotionally. And Ruth's voice grew thick, translating, "She says we're too kind. She says she doesn't deserve this." "Everyone deserves kindness," Samuel heard himself say, the words coming from some deep place he'd thought frozen. "You showed it to my girls. Now it's returned." That evening tested every boundary of propriety Samuel had promised the judge. Clara insisted on helping with supper, moving around the kitchen with an efficiency that highlighted how much they'd let slip. She found the sourdough starter nearly dead in its crock, clicked her tongue in silent disapproval, and set about reviving it. The girls watched, fascinated, as she showed them through gesture how to feed it, how to tell when it was happy. Samuel started to eat standing by the stove, his habit these 2 years. But Clara gently touched his arm, pointed to the table. Her meaning was clear: families eat together. So they sat, the 4 of them, at the table that had been too large for 3. Clara had somehow made a meal from their meager supplies that tasted like hope. Beans seasoned with wild herbs she'd spotted and gathered during their walk from barn to cabin. Cornbread from the last of their meal. Preserved peaches Samuel had forgotten existed in the back of the pantry. The girls chattered through dinner, teaching Clara their names for things, learning her signs for others. Samuel watched this stranger bring life back to his table and felt something shift in his chest. Not quite thawing, but acknowledgement that ice might not be permanent. After dinner, Clara tried to clean everything herself, but the girls wouldn't allow it. They worked together, Ruth washing, Grace drying, Clara putting away and already reorganizing shelves that had devolved into chaos. Samuel sat by the fire, ostensibly mending harness, but actually watching this domestic dance with wonder and wariness in equal measure. When full dark came, Clara signed something to the girls, pressed her hand to her heart, and moved toward the door. Samuel rose to walk her to the barn. Propriety demanded it, but also simple safety. The path was rough and she was exhausted. The moon was new, leaving only starlight to guide them. Clara stopped halfway to the barn, looking up at the vast spray of stars across the Wyoming sky. Her face transformed with wonder, and she signed something elaborate at the heavens. "What did she say?" Samuel asked Ruth, who'd followed despite being told to stay inside. Ruth watched Clara's hands repeat the signs. She says the stars are God's way of showing us light exists even in the darkest places. She says prison had no stars." Prison. Of course. She'd been held somewhere awaiting trial or judgment. Samuel felt anger rise at the thought of this dignified woman locked away from sky and stars. Clara touched Ruth's head gently, made a shooing motion toward the cabin. The girl hugged Clara suddenly, fiercely, then ran back to the house. In the darkness, Samuel saw Clara touch her cheek where Ruth's face had pressed. At the barn, Samuel lit the lantern in her loft space. Clara moved to the small table, picked up the pencil and paper he'd left there. She wrote in careful, educated script, "Your daughters are treasures. Your wife raised them well." He read it twice, throat tight. She did. Mary was. She knew how to make a home. Clara wrote again. "A home remains. It just sleeps, waiting." Before he could respond, she gently ushered him toward the ladder, clearly exhausted and needing solitude. He descended, paused at the bottom. "Thank you," he called up softly, "for helping with supper, for being kind to them." A hand appeared over the loft edge, signing what he somehow understood as good night. Walking back to the cabin, Samuel noticed the kitchen window glowing warm with lamplight, heard his daughters talking excitedly about their new words. The house sounded alive in a way it hadn't for 2 years. Inside, he found the girls had pulled out Mary's old slate and chalk, practicing the hand signs Clara had taught them. They looked up when he entered, faces bright with purpose. "Papa," Grace said, "we want to learn to talk with our hands so Clara doesn't feel alone." "She's been alone a long time," Ruth added, older and understanding more. "People are cruel to those who are different." Samuel sat with them, letting them show him simple signs. "Hello." "Thank you." "Good." His fingers felt clumsy copying their movements, but the girls were patient teachers. Later, after the girls were abed, Samuel stood on the porch. The barn was dark, Clara presumably asleep. But then he saw it, a brief flicker of light, like she'd gotten up to look out the loft window. He raised his hand in the darkness, attempting the sign for good night the girls had taught him. The light flickered again, perhaps in response, perhaps coincidence. He sat in Mary's rocking chair for the first time since her death. It creaked under his weight, familiar and foreign at once. The night was full of small sounds. Crickets, a distant coyote, the barn cat hunting mice. Normal sounds of a living farm. But tonight they seemed fuller somehow, as if the presence of another soul trying to sleep nearby gave them more meaning. Sheriff Morrison arrived at dawn, just as Samuel was heading to milk their single cow. The sheriff's horse was lathered despite the cool morning. "Came to check on the arrangement," Morrison said, but his eyes were kind. "Make sure everything's proper." Samuel knew this was Morrison's way of warning him about gossip, about those who'd question a deaf woman living on his property. "See for yourself," he said, gesturing to the barn where Clara was just descending the ladder, fully dressed, dignified as always despite her borrowed clothes. She saw the sheriff and paused, that wariness returning to her features. But then Grace burst from the cabin, running barefoot through the dew to grab Clara's hand, pulling her toward the chicken coop they'd discovered she intended to repair. Morrison watched this, watched Ruth follow with breakfast for Clara, a biscuit and preserve wrapped in cloth. "Seems like she's fitting in," he observed. "She's helping," Samuel said carefully. "The girls need a woman's influence." Morrison nodded slowly. "Judge Thornton won't like it going smooth. He had other plans for that woman. Ugly plans. Then he should have proven his accusations before making them." The sheriff mounted his horse. "Watch yourself, Hawkins, and watch her. There's more to this story than a simple murder accusation. The dead husband had debts, enemies. Some powerful people wanted someone to blame quick and quiet." After Morrison left, Samuel found Clara in the garden, pulling weeds with focused intensity. The girls knelt beside her, learning the difference between vegetable shoots and invasive grass. She looked up at his approach, a question in her eyes. "You're safe here," he said slowly, clearly. "I promise you that." She studied his face for a long moment, then signed something elaborate. Grace translated. "She says safety isn't real, but kindness is. She says she'll earn her keep." And she did. By noon, the garden was cleared. By evening, the chicken coop was ready for new birds. The girls followed her like ducklings, absorbing her silent lessons in a dozen small skills. Samuel watched from a distance, repairing the fence, and wondered how someone accused of murder could have hands so gentle, patience so deep. That night, Clara joined them for supper again, this time bringing wild greens she'd gathered, showing the girls which were safe to eat. The meal was richer for her contribution. After dinner, she pulled out paper and pencil, began teaching the girls their letters with more patience than Samuel had ever managed. Their education had suffered these 2 years of grief. Clara was fixing that too, apparently. When it came time to walk her to the barn, all three of them went. The girls had insisted on putting flowers in her loft, wild prairie roses in a mason jar. Clara's eyes went wet at the sight, and she hugged both girls long and tight. As they walked back to the cabin, Ruth said quietly, "Papa, she makes things better." Samuel couldn't argue with that, but he also couldn't shake Morrison's warning. Someone had wanted Clara blamed and punished. That someone might not accept this resolution. Still, watching his daughters practice their hand signs by lamplight, seeing the cleaned kitchen and organized shelves, feeling the shift from mere survival toward something like living, Samuel thought perhaps some risks were worth taking. That night, he sat in Mary's chair again, rocking slowly. The barn was dark except for that single flicker of light that said Clara was probably sitting by her window, perhaps wondering what she'd gotten herself into, perhaps just grateful for a view of stars. He practiced the sign for welcome that Ruth had taught him, his hands moving in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. They needed supplies. The town would talk. Judge Thornton would scheme. But tonight, his daughters slept peacefully. A kind woman rested in his barn, and the empty spaces in his home felt less like wounds and more like places waiting to heal. The rocking chair creaked its familiar rhythm. For the first time in 2 years, the sound didn't hurt. The morning sun found Clara and the girls in the garden, their hands moving in animated conversation that needed no sound. Samuel paused in his work on the fence, watching Ruth sign something that made Clara laugh, a real laugh, silent but full-bodied, her shoulders shaking with mirth. It had been 3 weeks since he'd brought her home from the square, and the transformation was remarkable. The garden itself told the story. What had been a tangle of weeds and volunteer plants was now ordered rows of late vegetables, squash, turnips, winter cabbage. Clara had shown the girls how to build small cold frames from old windows she'd found in the barn, extending the growing season. Their hands were dirty, their faces bright with purpose. "Papa, look," Grace called out, speaking and signing simultaneously now, a habit both girls had developed. "Clara says we can grow greens all winter if we're clever about it." Clara looked up at him, her dark eyes warm with something that might have been pride. She signed something to Grace, who translated, "She wants to know if she can trade preserves for lumber in town, to build a better cold frame." Samuel nodded, though the mention of town tightened his shoulders. Their last trip had been difficult. The stairs, the whispers, Mrs. Henderson actually crossing the street to avoid them. But they needed supplies, and Clara had proved herself resourceful at stretching what they had. That evening, after the girls had practiced their letters, Clara was a stricter teacher than Mary had been, but kinder too. Samuel found himself sitting at the kitchen table with her, a lamp between them, paper and pencil facilitating conversation. "You can read and write better than most," he wrote. "How?" Clara's hand moved across the paper in elegant script. "My father was a teacher. Before I lost my hearing to scarlet fever at 7, I'd already learned. After, he made sure I continued. Said the world would be cruel enough without ignorance adding to my burdens. Wise man. Dead now. Mother, too. Perhaps that's why I married poorly. Loneliness makes us foolish." Samuel studied her face in the lamplight. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 30, with premature lines around her eyes from squinting to read lips, from straining to understand a world that rarely slowed down for her. "Your husband," he wrote carefully. "What really happened?" Clara's hand stilled. Then, slowly. "Thomas was a gambler, charming when he won, cruel when he lost. He lost often, the night he died. He'd been drinking, fighting with someone about a debt. I was asleep. Woke to find him dead in our kitchen, knife in his chest, blood everywhere." She paused, her hand trembling slightly, then continued. "I couldn't hear who might have been there, couldn't call for help properly. When neighbors finally came, I was trying to stop the bleeding, made me look guilty. Thomas owed money to important people. Easier to blame the deaf wife than investigate properly. Samuel felt anger rise in his throat. No one spoke for you. Who speaks for a deaf woman? I wrote my innocence 100 times, but silence is suspicious to those who live in noise. Before Samuel could respond, Ruth appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes. Papa, Clara, I had a bad dream. Clara rose immediately. Opening her arms, Ruth fell into them, and Clara's hands began moving in gentle, soothing patterns. Whatever she was saying, it worked. Ruth's breathing calmed, and soon she was signing back, explaining her dream. Samuel watched this near stranger comfort his daughter with more natural ease than he'd managed in 2 years of trying, and felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking, but opening, like a door sealed shut, suddenly remembering it could swing wide. The next morning brought an unexpected test. Samuel was shoeing the horse when he heard the girls shouting. He ran toward the sound, finding them by the creek that bordered their property. Clara stood knee-deep in the water, holding something. No, someone. The Garrett boy from the neighboring farm. 8 years old and soaking wet, coughing up stream water. Clara had him on the bank before Samuel reached them, her hands checking him over with practiced efficiency. The boy had fallen from the log crossing, hit his head on a rock. Blood seeped from a gash above his eyebrow. Clara signed rapidly to Ruth, who ran for the house. Grace, run to the Garretts. Tell them what happened. Samuel ordered. Then, to Clara. What do you need? She was already pressing her torn petticoat strip against the wound, signing one-handed to show she needed needle and thread. Hot water. Whiskey for cleaning. Her movements were confident, experienced. When Ruth returned with supplies, Clara sutured the wound with steady hands while Samuel held the crying boy still. By the time Bob Garrett arrived, wild-eyed with panic, his son was bandaged and sipping honeyed tea, wrapped in one of Mary's quilts. Clara had even checked his eyes for signs of concussion, showing Samuel how the pupils should react to light. She saved him, Ruth told Mr. Garrett firmly. Pulled him right out of the water and fixed him up. She knew just what to do. Garrett looked at Clara with confusion and dawning gratitude. His wife had been one of the loudest voices against the murderess living so close. Thank you, he said slowly, making sure Clara could see his lips. Thank you kindly. Clara nodded, signed something. Grace translated. She says head wounds bleed scary but heal clean if tended right. Keep it dry for 3 days. Watch for fever. As the Garretts left, their boy walking steadily between them, Bob turned back. I misjudged, he said to Samuel. Helen did too. We'll make it right. That evening, Helen Garrett appeared at their door with a fresh baked pie and a contrite expression. She spoke directly to Clara, slowly and clearly. I'm sorry. You saved my boy. I was wrong about you. Clara accepted the pie graciously, and somehow, without words, conveyed that no apology was needed. After Helen left, the girls cheered and danced around the kitchen. Even Samuel felt his mouth pulling into an unfamiliar shape, a smile, rusty from disuse. The next few days brought a shift. Word spread about the rescue. Some neighbors began nodding instead of turning away. The minister's wife brought fabric scraps for quilting. The schoolmarm, Miss Patterson, rode out to discuss having Clara help with the younger children's letters. It was during one of these peaceful afternoons, Clara teaching the girls to make soap while Samuel repaired harness. That understanding struck him like lightning. He was humming Mary's favorite hymn, the one the girls had sung on that first wagon ride. He stopped abruptly, but Clara had noticed. She signed something to the girls that made them grin. What? He asked. Ruth's eyes danced. She says music lives in the chest, not the ears. She says she can feel you humming through the floorboards. Clara placed her hand briefly on the floor, then on her chest, demonstrating. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw recognition of what that humming meant. The thaw was real. That night, after walking Clara to the barn, Samuel stood under the stars longer than usual. The weight he'd carried for 2 years hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, become something bearable. His daughters laughed again. The house smelled of bread and soap and life. A woman of remarkable courage slept in his barn, bringing order to chaos with her damaged hands and silence that spoke volumes. He thought of Mary, wondered what she'd make of this. The answer came immediately. Clear as her voice had once been, she'd say it was about time. She'd never wanted them to stay frozen in grief. She'd probably even like Clara, recognizing a fellow warrior in the battle to civilize a homestead and raise good children. The next morning brought Clara's suggestion, written carefully over breakfast. May I teach the girls sign language properly? There's a system, from France, used in deaf schools back east. I could make them truly fluent. Samuel watched his daughters' eager faces. Yes, he said aloud, then attempted the sign Ruth had taught him, his fingers clumsy but determined. Clara smiled that sunrise smile and began immediately, showing them the alphabet, how letters could be built in the air. The girls absorbed it like dry earth takes rain. Within an hour, they were spelling words to each other, delighted with their secret language. But Samuel noticed Clara kept pausing, her hand going to her throat. When she coughed, harsh and rattling, he felt ice form in his stomach. She waved off concern, but her cheeks were flushed in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. You're ill, he said firmly. She shook her head, signed something dismissive, but Ruth looked worried, translating. She says it's nothing, just tired. The creek was cold. Samuel thought of the Garrett boy, the rescue, Clara plunging into freezing water without hesitation. Heroes often paid prices they didn't count in advance. That evening, Clara's absence at supper told its own story. Samuel found her in the barn loft, burning with fever, her breathing labored. The girls stood at the bottom of the ladder, tears streaming. Get the doctor, he told Ruth. Ride fast. Grace, bring water and clean cloths. As his daughters ran to their tasks, Samuel knelt beside Clara's pallet. Her eyes were glazed but aware. She signed weakly, and though he didn't understand the words, he recognized the meaning. I'm sorry. Don't, he said fiercely. Don't you dare apologize. You saved that boy. Now let us save you. She managed a weak smile before the fever took her under. Samuel sat beside her, pressing cool cloths to her burning skin, and found himself praying for the first time since Mary's death. Not bargaining, not pleading, just offering up this simple truth they needed her, not just for what she did, but for who she was, for the light she'd brought back to their darkness. The doctor would come. The fever would break or it wouldn't. But Samuel knew with sudden, absolute clarity that Clara belonged here, belonged with them, not from obligation or debt or propriety, but from something deeper and more dangerous and infinitely more precious. Love, he realized with wonder and terror in equal measure. Somewhere between the garden and the soap-making and the silent conversations, he'd begun to love her. Not like he'd loved Mary. That was a young love, built on dreams and possibility. This was different, a love born of struggle and sorrow and the choice to continue living despite the weight of loss. The girls returned, the doctor riding hard behind them. As he examined Clara, Samuel held his daughters close, all three of them watching this woman who'd become essential to their lives fight against the fever that sought to steal her away. Pneumonia, the doctor said grimly. From the cold water, most likely. It'll be a hard fight. Samuel nodded, jaw set. They'd already fought through grief, through gossip, through judgment. They could fight through this too. Clara had taught them her language of hands and silence. Now they would teach her theirs, the language of staying, of refusing to let go, of choosing to live when living seemed impossible. The empty chair on the porch no longer mocked them. It waited, patient as spring, for the family they were becoming to be complete. The fever broke on the third day, leaving Clara weak as a newborn calf, but alive. Samuel had moved her to the house despite propriety. The barn loft was too cold for recovery, and the girls had refused to leave her side anyway. She lay in Mary's bed. When had he started thinking of it as just the bed again, propped on pillows? Teaching the girls new signs even while too weak to sit up properly. It had been 2 weeks since her recovery began, and today was their first trip to town since the illness. Samuel watched Clara pin her hair carefully, her movements still slower than before but determined. She wore Mary's good dress, the green wool that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes. The girls had insisted. "You don't have to come," he said for the 3rd time. Clara's hands moved firmly. "I need to show them I'm not hiding." The ride to town felt different with Clara on the wagon seat beside him, Ruth and Grace chattering between them. People would talk, they always did, but Samuel found he cared less about their opinions and more about the color returning to Clara's cheeks, the way she pointed out late-blooming wildflowers to the girls. Copper Creek's Main Street was busy with Saturday shopping. Samuel felt the change immediately, conversations stopping, heads turning, eyes tracking their wagon's progress. At the Mercantile, Mrs. Henderson stood blocking the doorway like a fortress gate. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, her voice carrying deliberately, "I'm afraid I cannot serve certain persons." Clara's hand touched Samuel's arm lightly, a gentle restraint. She pulled out her small notebook, wrote quickly, and showed it to Mrs. Henderson. "I understand. May the children at least purchase what they need." Mrs. Henderson's face went red. "The children aren't the issue, as you well know." "Then what is—" Samuel's voice came out harder than intended. "This woman saved the Garrett boy. She's teaching children their letters. What exactly is your objection?" "She's accused of murder." "Accused," Samuel repeated. "Not convicted, not tried. Accused by men who wanted someone convenient to blame." A crowd was gathering. Judge Thornton emerged from the bank, his face lighting with malicious interest. "Problems? Henderson?" "No problem," Samuel said firmly. "We're leaving." But Clara stepped forward, her notebook out again. She wrote rapidly, then held it up for all to see. "I cannot speak to defend myself, but I can write. My husband died owing money to Mr. Thornton's brother-in-law. Strange how quickly I was accused after refusing to sign over our land to settle those debts." The crowd murmured. Thornton's face went purple. "Lies. This woman is a murderess, and now a liar." Clara kept writing, calm as deep water. "Check the land records. See who owns my husband's property now. Ask why no investigation was done. Ask why a deaf woman with no blood on her clothes or hands was blamed for a stabbing she couldn't have heard happening." Samuel watched understanding dawn on several faces. Tom Morrison, the sheriff's deputy, stepped forward. "Judge, is it true about the land? That's not relevant to—" "Seems pretty relevant." Bob Garrett interrupted, his son's bandage still visible beneath his hat. "This woman saved my boy. She had no cause to do that if she's what you say." Clara wrote again. "I will answer any questions, submit to any investigation. But I will not be condemned without proof, and I will not hide." She turned to Mrs. Henderson, wrote once more. "Your nephew struggles with his letters. I would teach him freely, as I do the other children. Hatred is learned. Kindness is too." Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging. Her nephew Timothy was indeed struggling in school, had been held back a year. That is. Mrs. Henderson stepped aside. "Perhaps I was hasty." They completed their shopping in tense silence, other customers giving them wide berth but watching intently. Clara selected items carefully, writing her thanks to the clerk, maintaining dignity despite the whispers. At the door, Judge Thornton blocked their path. "This isn't over," he hissed at Samuel. "That woman belongs in prison or worse." Clara stepped between them, small but fierce. Her hands moved in signs the girls didn't translate them, but Thornton stepped back as if slapped. She pulled out her notebook one last time, showed it to him, then to Samuel. It said simply, "Truth always wins, just sometimes it needs help." The ride home was quiet until they passed the schoolhouse. Miss Patterson stood outside, waving them down. "Clara, Mrs. Miss," she flushed. "I wondered if you might help with the younger students. Several are struggling, and your methods with the Hawkins girls are remarkable." Clara's face transformed. She nodded eagerly, signing rapidly. Ruth translated. "She says she'd be honored. She says children deserve every chance to learn." "Monday, then," Miss Patterson smiled. "I can't pay much, but—" "She'll be there," Samuel said firmly. As they continued home, Grace asked quietly, "Papa, why did Judge Thornton look scared?" Samuel had wondered the same. What did Clara sign to him? Ruth bit her lip. She said she knows about his visits to the saloon girls, and his wife might like to know too. She said deaf doesn't mean blind. Samuel coughed to hide his sudden laugh. Clara looked at him innocently, but he caught the mischief in her eyes. This quiet woman had steel in her spine and wasn't afraid to use it. That evening, as they sat around the table for supper, Clara pulled out a larger piece of paper. She wrote carefully, "I need to tell you about Thomas. All of it. You deserve the truth." Samuel nodded. The girls leaned in. Clara wrote steadily, filling the page. "Thomas married me for my father's money. Didn't know it was all spent on doctors trying to cure my deafness. When he found out, he changed. He drank, gambled, blamed me for his losses. Said no one could cheat a man with a deaf wife because I couldn't hear their plans. The night he died, I'd locked myself in our bedroom. He'd been drinking, was angry about a debt. I felt the floor shake from footsteps, fighting. When it got quiet, I came out, found him dead, blood everywhere. I tried to help, but it was too late. I think I know who killed him, Marcus Thornton, the judge's brother-in-law. Thomas had been talking. I read lips about having proof Marcus cheated at cards. But who believes a deaf woman over a judge's family?" Samuel studied her face as she wrote. No deception there, just exhausted truth. "We believe you," he said firmly. "We do." Ruth echoed. Taking Clara's hand, Grace climbed into Clara's lap. "You're good. We know you're good." Clara held the child close, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. When she finally pulled back, she wrote, "I never thought I'd have family again." "You do now," Samuel said, the words coming from that deep place that had been opening since she arrived. "We're family now." The word hung in the air like a promise. Family. Not the one he'd planned or lost, but the one being built from broken pieces and unexpected grace. That night, there was no question of Clara returning to the barn. The girls made her a proper bed in the main room, near the stove for warmth. Samuel knew tongues would wag, but Clara's health mattered more than gossip. As he helped arrange her blankets, their hands touched accidentally. Clara didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her palm up, let their fingers intertwine for just a moment. A question and answer all at once. When she signed "Good night," her movements included something new. Ruth, watching from her doorway, whispered, "Papa." She signed "Dear ones" after "Good night." That means she loves us. Samuel's throat went tight. He attempted to sign back, his movements clumsy but earnest. "We love you too." Clara's smile could have lit the whole prairie. Late that night, Samuel heard horses approaching. He grabbed his rifle, stepped onto the porch. Sheriff Morrison and 2 deputies materialized from the darkness. "Samuel," Morrison said quietly, "we've got a problem. Marcus Thornton's disappeared. Left a note confessing to killing Clara's husband. Judge Thornton is saying Clara forged it, that she must have killed Marcus too." Samuel's grip tightened on the rifle. "She's been here, sick and recovering. You know that. I know it. But the judge is demanding we search your property. Arrest her again. Morrison looked genuinely distressed. I'm trying to buy time, but... Sheriff, one of the deputies called from near the well. Found something. They pulled up a saddlebag from behind the well housing. Inside, blood-stained clothes and Marcus Thornton's distinctive pocket watch. Morrison's face went grim. That's planted evidence if I ever saw it. Someone's trying to frame her again, Samuel said quietly. Question is, who benefits? Judge does, Morrison said thoughtfully. If Clara's convicted, he keeps Marcus's property and removes a witness to his corruption. He looked at Samuel directly. I'm not arresting anyone tonight, but you need to find proof of who really killed Thomas. And now what happened to Marcus? Fast. After they left, Samuel found Clara standing in the doorway, fully dressed. She'd felt the horses through the floorboards. Her notebook was already out. They want to blame me again. Not this time, Samuel said firmly. This time, you're not alone. She studied his face, then wrote, Why do you believe me? Samuel thought of Mary, of loss, of the empty chair that no longer seemed like an ending. Because you brought us back to life, because the girls trust you, because... He stopped, then made himself continue. Because I've seen your heart, and there's no murder there. Clara stepped closer, reached up to touch his face. Her fingers traced the worry lines, the premature gray at his temples. Then she signed something he didn't need translation for. It was gratitude and trust and something deeper, something that made his chest ache with possibility. They stood there in the darkness, two damaged souls finding strength in each other, while outside the wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming rain and harder trials ahead. But for now, in this moment, they were together. And that, Samuel thought, might be enough to face whatever storm was coming. The morning after Sheriff Morrison's visit, Samuel woke to find dead roses scattered across the porch, their petals black with rot. A note was pinned to the door with a hunting knife. The murderess brings death to all she touches. Send her away or share her fate. Clara stood beside him, reading the message. Her face remained composed, but Samuel saw her hands tremble as she signed to the girls, who had crowded behind them in their nightgowns. She says it's just flowers, Ruth translated, but her voice wavered. She says cowards always work in darkness. Samuel pulled the knife free, studied it. Good steel, expensive handle, not a farmer's tool. Girls, go inside, get dressed for school. But, Papa, Grace started. Inside, now. As they reluctantly obeyed, Clara wrote in her notebook, I should leave. This danger follows me. Not you. Samuel's response was to tear the threatening note into pieces. We've discussed this. You're family now. Family doesn't run. She studied his face, then wrote, Your wife's roses. Someone destroyed them to hurt you through me. It was true. Mary had planted those climbing roses their first year here, babied them through drought and winter, to see them destroyed. Samuel felt rage build in his chest, cold and focused. Then we'll plant new ones, he said firmly. Together. Judge Thornton arrived at midday, accompanied by two hired men who looked more suited to saloon brawls than legal work. The judge sat his horse like a king surveying peasants, his voice carrying across the yard. Hawkins, I've come with a generous offer. Send the woman away, and I'll forget your interference, even help you find a proper wife, someone suitable to raise your daughters. Samuel stepped onto the porch, rifle casual in his hands. My daughters have all the mother they need. The word mother hung in the air. He hadn't meant to say it, but it felt right, true. Through the window, he saw Clara's eyes widen. Thornton's face darkened. You'd replace your dear wife with that creature? I'd give my daughters someone who loves them, someone who teaches them that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it signs in silence. One of Thornton's men shifted, hand moving toward his pistol. Samuel raised his rifle slightly. I wouldn't. My neighbors are watching. It was true. Bob Garrett stood by his fence line, rifle visible. Tom Morrison had appeared near the creek. Word had spread about the morning's threat. Thornton noticed too. His jaw clenched. "You're making a mistake, Hawkins. That woman killed her husband, and now my brother-in-law is missing. She's poison." Clara stepped onto the porch, notebook in hand. She wrote quickly, showed it to Thornton. "Marcus confessed before he ran. You know it. You're scared, I know why." "Lies," Thornton sputtered, but fear flickered in his eyes. Clara kept writing. "The silver mine. The claims you and Marcus stole. Thomas knew. That's why Marcus killed him." Samuel watched Thornton go pale. Silver mine. This was new information. "You can't prove anything," Thornton said, but his voice had lost its power. Clara smiled, cold and certain. She signed something complex, and Ruth appeared in the doorway to translate. "She says the proof is in Thomas's journal, hidden where only a deaf woman would think to look, inside the piano no one thought she could play." It was a bluff. Had to be. But Thornton bought it, his face cycling through fear, rage, and calculation. "If that journal existed, you'd have shown it before." Clara wrote, "I was alone then. Now I have witnesses. Protection. A reason to fight." Thornton wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over. You've just declared war on the wrong man. Hawkins." After they left, Samuel found Clara shaking on the porch step. He sat beside her, careful not to touch. The neighbors were still watching. "Is there really a journal?" She nodded. Wrote, "Thomas hid things in the piano. Thought I didn't know. I haven't retrieved it. Too dangerous alone. We'll go tonight. Together." She looked at him with such gratitude and trust that Samuel felt his heart crack a little wider. How had this silent woman become so essential so quickly? That evening, leaving the girls with the Garretts, Bob had insisted, rifle prominently displayed. Samuel and Clara rode to her old homestead. The house stood empty, windows broken, door hanging askew. Someone had ransacked it searching for something. The piano stood in the parlor, covered in dust but intact, too heavy to steal, too complicated to search properly. Clara showed Samuel the hidden compartment beneath the keyboard. Inside a leather journal, pages covered with Thomas's cramped writing. By lamplight, they read Thomas's records of Thornton and Marcus's schemes, forged claims, murdered prospectors, a silver vein worth thousands. Thomas had planned to blackmail them. Instead, they'd killed him. "This is enough to hang them both," Samuel said quietly. Clara wrote, "Marcus is probably dead. Thornton wouldn't leave him alive to confess." She was right. They needed to move carefully. Samuel tucked the journal inside his coat. As they turned to leave, Clara touched the piano keys softly. No sound for her, but Samuel heard the faint, discordant notes. She wrote, "I used to play. Before the fever. Music was everything." Samuel covered her hand with his. "You still make music, just differently now. The girls sing more since you came. The house has rhythm again." She leaned against him, just for a moment. He felt her breathing, felt the trust in that small gesture. Then footsteps on the porch shattered the moment. 3 men burst in. Thornton's hired thugs. Samuel pushed Clara behind him, drew his pistol. "Back off. Now." "Can't do that," the largest one said. "Judge wants the woman and whatever you found." "Then the judge will be disappointed." The thug smiled. 3 against 1, and you with a woman to protect." Clara moved before Samuel could stop her. She threw the lamp at the nearest man, plunging the room into darkness. Samuel heard scuffling, a cry of pain. Then Clara's hand found his, pulling him toward the back door. They ran, gunshots splintering wood behind them. The horses were gone, stolen or scared off. They ran toward the creek, Clara surprisingly fast despite her skirts. Behind them, shouts and crashing through brush. Samuel pulled Clara down behind a fallen cottonwood. pressed his finger to her lips unnecessarily. She couldn't cry out if she wanted to. The men passed, cursing. When their sounds faded, Samuel and Clara began the long walk home, staying off the road, using moonlight and memory to navigate. Halfway home, Clara stumbled, exhaustion catching up. Samuel caught her, and she stayed in his arms a moment too long. In the moonlight, her face was silver in shadow, beautiful and vulnerable. "Clara," he whispered, forgetting she couldn't hear. But she read his lips, saw something in his expression. She reached up, touched his face, and signed something he didn't understand but felt in his bones. Then she pulled away, pointed toward home. The girls would be worried. They arrived at dawn to find Sheriff Morrison on the porch with the girls. Ruth ran to them, sobbing. "We thought you were dead. The Thornton men came here, tore up the house looking for something." Inside, the damage was thorough but not devastating. Furniture overturned, drawers emptied, but nothing destroyed. The journal, still in Samuel's coat, seemed to burn against his ribs. Morrison took the journal, read it with growing excitement. "This is it. This is enough. But we need more. We need to find Marcus or his body." Clara wrote quickly, "Check the old mine shaft. The collapsed one near Trinity Creek. Thomas mentioned Marcus was afraid of it." Morrison nodded. "I'll take deputies. You folks stay here. Stay together. Thornton's desperate now. Desperate men do terrible things." That night, Samuel sat guard on the porch while Clara and the girls slept inside. He thought about Mary, about the life they'd planned. Then he thought about Clara, about the life they were building from ruins and resilience. A sound made him tense, footsteps on the path. But it was Bob Garrett and 3 other neighbors, all armed. "Thought you could use company," Bob said simply. "That woman in there saved my boy. We pay our debts." By morning, 6 men stood guard. By noon, their wives had arrived with food and support. Mrs. Henderson brought her nephew Timothy, shyly asking if Clara might have time for a lesson despite everything. Clara, exhausted and stressed, still sat with the boy, patiently showing him how letters could make sense. Watching her, Samuel felt that dangerous emotion grow stronger. Not just gratitude or respect or even desire, though all those were there. Love. Different from what he'd felt for Mary, but no less real. Ruth appeared at his elbow. "Papa, you look at Clara the way you used to look at Mama." "Ruth, it's okay," his daughter said quietly. "Mama would want us happy. Clara makes us happy. She makes you happy." That evening, Morrison returned with news. They'd found Marcus, shot, buried shallow in the collapsed mine. They'd also found 2 more bodies, older, probably prospectors who'd discovered the silver first. "Thornton's barricaded in his house," Morrison reported. "Won't come out. We need Clara to testify. Write out what she knows for the circuit judge." Clara nodded, already reaching for paper. But Samuel saw her exhaustion, the tremor in her hands. She'd been strong for so long, but everyone had limits. "Tomorrow," he said firmly. "Tonight, she rests." That night, Samuel made a decision. After the girls were asleep, he found Clara on the porch, wrapped in Mary's shawl, watching stars. "Clara," he said, making sure she could see his lips in the lamplight. "When this is over, would you stay? Not because you need protection, but because—" He stopped, frustrated by the inadequacy of words. Clara studied his face for a long moment. Then she wrote, "I already am home. Samuel, you and the girls are my home." She stood, kissed his cheek gently, and went inside. Samuel stayed on the porch, heart pounding, watching stars and thinking about how sometimes the worst storms brought the most unexpected blessings. Tomorrow would bring resolution, trial, justice, freedom from Thornton's shadow. But tonight, Samuel allowed himself to hope for something more, a future where empty chairs were filled, where silence and sound made equal music, where broken families could heal into something even stronger than before. The wind carried the scent of rain and change. Samuel welcomed both. Sunday morning dawned crisp and bright, the kind of October day that made Wyoming's harsh beauty sing. Samuel dressed the girls in their best clothes, the dresses Clara had mended and pressed with such care. Clara herself wore Mary's blue church dress, the one with small pearl buttons that caught the light. She'd hesitated when Ruth offered it, but Samuel had nodded his approval. It was time. "Are you sure about this?" he asked Clara one more time as they prepared to leave for church. She wrote firmly, "Truth needs witnesses. The whole town needs to hear." The church was fuller than Samuel had ever seen it. Word had spread about the journal, about Marcus's body, about Judge Thornton's refusal to surrender to Sheriff Morrison. The congregation buzzed with speculation until Pastor Williams raised his hand for silence. "Before we begin our worship," the pastor said carefully, "I believe there's a matter of earthly justice that needs addressing. Miss Clara, I understand you have something to share." Clara rose from the pew, walked to the front of the church with that dignified grace Samuel had come to love. Ruth and Grace followed without being asked, positioning themselves as her voice. The congregation held its breath. Clara's hands began to move, and Ruth's clear voice filled the sanctuary. "I stand before you accused of murder. I cannot speak to defend myself, but my hands can tell truth as surely as any voice." Sunlight streamed through the eastern windows, casting Clara in golden light as she continued signing. Grace took over translating, her younger voice carrying surprising authority. "My husband Thomas died because he tried to blackmail evil men. Judge Thornton and Marcus Thornton stole claims, killed prospectors, built their wealth on blood." A murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Thornton, who'd been sitting in his usual front pew, stood abruptly. "This is lies. This woman is a murderess." But Clara kept signing, and Ruth continued. "Thomas kept records, dates, names, amounts stolen. The journal Sheriff Morrison has proves everything. Marcus killed Thomas to keep him quiet, then tried to blame me because I couldn't hear the murder happen, couldn't call for help properly." Mrs. Henderson stood suddenly. "It's true about the claims. My late husband always said something was wrong with how the Thorntons got that silver mine. Said the original prospectors just disappeared. And that night," Bob Garrett added, standing too, "the night Thomas died, I saw Marcus near their house. Thought nothing of it then, but now." More people stood, adding pieces to the puzzle. The merchant admitting Thornton had pressured him to refuse Clara service. The schoolmarm confirming Clara's stellar character. Even the minister's wife, mentioning seeing Marcus burning bloody clothes the day after Thomas's death. Clara kept signing, her movements becoming larger, more emphatic. Ruth's voice rose. "I was convenient to blame. A deaf woman, isolated, unable to defend herself. But God sees all, hears all, even the silence of injustice." Judge Thornton pushed through the crowd toward Clara, his face purple with rage. "You lying witch! You've poisoned this whole town against me!" Samuel moved to intercept him, but Clara raised her hand, stopping him. She faced Thornton directly, her eyes steady. Then she signed something that made both girls gasp. "What did she say?" Pastor Williams asked. Ruth's voice was small but clear. "She says she forgives him. She says hatred is a poison that kills the vessel that holds it. She says she chooses life." The church went absolutely silent. Thornton stood frozen, mouth open, all his rage suddenly impotent against such grace. Sheriff Morrison entered through the back door, deputies flanking him. "Judge Thornton, you're under arrest for conspiracy to murder, theft, and fraud." Thornton looked around wildly, seeking support, but found only turned backs and averted eyes. "You can't. I'm a judge. I represent the law." "No," Morrison said quietly. "You corrupted it. The circuit judge reviewed the evidence last night. Your appointment's been revoked." As they led Thornton away, he turned back to Clara. Why? He asked, seeming genuinely confused. Why forgive me after everything? Clara wrote quickly, showed him the paper. Because someone needs to break the cycle. My daughters deserve a world with less hate. My daughters. Samuel's breath caught. She'd written, my daughters. After church. The townspeople surrounded Clara, not with hostility but with apologies. Support, even admiration. Mrs. Henderson pressed Clara's hands, tears streaming. I'm so sorry. So terribly sorry. Can you forgive me too? Clara embraced her. And somehow that said everything. The crowd gradually dispersed. But Miss Patterson lingered. Clara, I've had a telegram from the Territorial School Board. They've heard about your teaching methods, your success with struggling students. They want to offer you a formal position, head teacher for special cases. Children who need different approaches. Clara's eyes widened. She signed rapidly to the girls. She says she's honored, Grace translated, but she needs to discuss it with her family first. Her family. Samuel's heart swelled. That afternoon, they held a celebration at the homestead. Neighbors brought food, instruments, laughter. The house that had been silent for 2 years rang with music and joy. Clara couldn't hear the fiddles and guitars, but she felt the rhythm through the floorboards, danced with Grace and Ruth, her face luminous with happiness. As evening fell and guests departed, Samuel found Clara in the garden, kneeling by the destroyed roses. She was planting something. New rose cuttings Mrs. Garrett had brought. They might not take before winter, he said, kneeling beside her. She wrote in the dirt with her finger, Hope plants anyway. Samuel caught her hand, dirty with soil and promise. Clara, I need to say something, ask something. She waited, those intelligent eyes patient. The girls love you. This home is alive again because of you. And I... He stopped, frustrated. How did you propose to someone who'd been trapped by one marriage, nearly destroyed by it? Clara squeezed his hand, then wrote in her notebook. Samuel, are you trying to ask me to stay forever? Yes. No. I mean... He took a breath. I'm trying to ask you to marry me. Not because you need protection, not because the girls need a mother, but because I love you. Because you've taught me that love can speak in any language, even silence. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She pulled her hand free, and for a horrible moment, Samuel thought she was refusing. Then she began to sign, slowly, making sure he could follow the signs she'd taught him. I love you too. Is that yes? She laughed, that silent, full-body laugh he'd come to cherish, and signed the word Ruth had taught him weeks ago. Yes. Samuel pulled her into his arms, there in the garden dirt, not caring who might see. Clara fit against him perfectly, her silent world meeting his speaking one in a harmony that needed no sound. Papa, Ruth's voice came from the porch. Are you proposing to Clara? She beat me to it, Grace added, bouncing with excitement. Samuel looked up to find both girls grinning widely. Would that be acceptable to you both? They flew off the porch, tackling Clara and Samuel in a tangle of arms and laughter. Yes, 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 they chanted. And Clara was laughing and crying simultaneously, holding all three of them like she'd never let go. That evening, as they sat around the table planning a wedding small, Pastor Williams officiating, November before the deep snow, Samuel watched his family, for that's what they were now, truly, and marveled at the journey. From that day in the square when 2 small hands had gripped his arms, whispering recognition, to this moment of complete acceptance and love. Clara caught him watching and signed, Happy. He signed back, the movement still clumsy but improving. Complete. Sheriff Morrison arrived after dinner with final news. Thornton's confessed everything. trying to save his neck by turning evidence on others involved. The territorial governors sending investigators. There might be compensation for the murdered prospectors' families. And for Clara, the seized property will be returned. Clara wrote, "I don't want that house. Too many shadows." "Oh, sell it then," Morrison suggested. "Start fresh." That night, after tucking the girls in, they insisted on Clara doing it too. One more story and signs and smiles. Samuel and Clara stood on the porch together. The stars were brilliant, the air sharp with coming winter. "No more barn for you," Samuel said. "After we're married. Clara wrote, "Scandal. What will people say? That Samuel Hawkins is the luckiest fool in Wyoming, marrying the bravest woman in the territory." She leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly under his chin. They stood in comfortable silence, her permanent silence and his chosen one, watching the stars that had witnessed their whole journey from suspicion to trust to love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Clara would start her formal teaching position. They'd plan a wedding. They'd face winter as a family. But tonight, in this perfect moment, Samuel felt Mary's presence like a blessing, as if she were saying, "Yes, this is right. This is what I wanted for you all." The empty rocking chair creaked gently in the wind, but it no longer seemed lonely. Soon, Clara would sit there, teaching the girls their lessons in the afternoon sun. The cycle of life, loss, and love continuing, made richer by its complexity. "Clara," Samuel said, knowing she'd read his lips. "Welcome home." She turned in his arms, reached up to touch his face, and signed the words he was still learning but understood perfectly. "I've been home since the moment your daughters called me back to life." They sealed the promise with a kiss, there under the Wyoming stars, while inside two girls pretended to sleep but actually whispered excitedly about weddings and dresses and having a mother who spoke with her hands and heard with her heart. The lamp in the window burned steady and bright, a beacon that said, "Here lives a family, unexpected but unbreakable, built from the ashes of loss and the architecture of love." The Harvest Festival filled Copper Creek's main street with the scent of apple cider and fresh bread, the sound of fiddles and laughter. 1 year had passed since Clara stood bound in the town square, and now she stood at the center of a different gathering. Children circled around her, their small hands moving in eager conversation as she taught them signs for the autumn treasures they'd found. Samuel watched from the mercantile steps, his heart full as Grace demonstrated to younger children how to sign pumpkin while Ruth helped Timothy Henderson with his letters at a nearby booth. Clara had transformed not just his family, but the entire town's understanding of difference and strength. "She's remarkable," Miss Patterson said, joining him. "Enrollment has increased by 12 students since word spread about her teaching methods. Parents are bringing children from 3 counties away." It was true. Clara's classroom, a converted storage room behind the main schoolhouse, had become a beacon for children who learned differently. Deaf children, yes, but also those who struggled with letters, who saw the world sideways, who needed patience and innovation rather than rote memorization. Mr. Hawkins, Bob Garrett approached, his son James running ahead. The boy's scar had faded to a thin white line, barely visible beneath his hat. "Want to thank you again for the lumber. New barn's going up fine." After selling Thomas's old property, Clara had insisted on using part of the money to help neighbors who'd stood by them. The rest went toward expanding the school and starting a small fund for families with children who needed extra help. "Clara's idea," Samuel said, though Bob already knew. Everything good these days seemed to be Clara's idea. The afternoon sun slanted golden across the square where Clara now stood with the mayor, her hands moving as Ruth translated for the crowd. They were discussing the new addition to the school, a proper classroom for what Clara called visual learning, funded by the territorial government after word of her success reached the capital. "Next year," Ruth translated, her voice clear and proud, "we hope to bring a trained teacher from the Gallaudet School for the Deaf. Every child deserves language, whether spoken or signed." The crowd applauded. Samuel noticed Judge Thornton's former house. now converted to a boarding house for families visiting their children at Clara's school. The transformation felt like justice. As evening approached, the harvest dance began. Clara couldn't hear the music, but she felt it through the wooden platform, her feet finding rhythm through vibration. Samuel led her through a reel, marveling at how she followed his lead through touch and sight alone. Around them, other couples danced, including several where one partner was deaf, teaching the town that difference didn't mean separation. "Papa, look," Grace called out, pointing to where Ruth was dancing with the Garrett's oldest boy, both of them signing and laughing as they moved. Clara followed his gaze and smiled, signing, "She's growing up." "Too fast." Samuel signed back, his movements now fluid after a year of practice. The music shifted to a slower waltz. Clara pressed closer, her head against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat. Her music, she'd written once. Around them, the town that had once condemned her now celebrated her, but Clara only had eyes for Samuel. "Thank you," she signed against his chest, where only he could feel it. "For what?" "For seeing me. Not my silence. Me." Samuel lifted her chin, making sure she could see his lips in the lantern light. "You were never silent. You spoke volumes from the beginning. I just had to learn how to listen." Someone tapped Samuel's shoulder, Pastor Williams, beaming. "Thought you should know. Just got word from the territorial board. Clara's been approved for that experimental program, bringing deaf children from the state orphanage here for education. Full funding." Clara's eyes widened. She'd written the proposal months ago, never truly believing it would be accepted. Now 20 deaf orphans would have a chance at real education, real communication, real life. The news spread through the crowd quickly, in spoken words and flying hands. The celebration intensified, but Clara pulled Samuel away from the noise and movement, leading him to the quiet area behind the church, where they'd been married 11 months before. In the relative privacy, she pulled out the small notebook she always carried. "I have news too," she wrote. "I've been waiting for the right moment." Samuel's heart jumped, hoping but not daring to assume. Clara took his hand, placed it on her stomach, and signed the word Grace had taught him just last week while giggling mysteriously, "Baby." Samuel's knees nearly buckled. We're... Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. She wrote quickly. "The doctor says spring or April, maybe. But you were told, after the fever." "Miracles happen," she wrote. "We're living proof." Samuel pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet, spinning her in the darkness while she laughed that beautiful, silent laugh. When he set her down, she was signing rapidly, and he had to ask her to slow down so he could understand. "I want our child to know both worlds," she signed carefully. "Speaking and signing, sound and silence. Like our family." "Like our family," Samuel agreed, kissing her deeply. They returned to find the girls looking for them, faces bright with excitement from the festival. "Mama, Papa, they want you to dance again," Grace said, then signed it for emphasis, the dual communication that had become second nature to them all. "Mama." The word still made Clara's eyes wet every time. She'd become Mama gradually, naturally, not replacing Mary, but adding to her memory. The house now held photographs of both women, stories of both mothers, love multiplied rather than divided. 6 months later, April 1885, the birthing was hard, as Clara couldn't hear the midwife's instructions, but Ruth and Grace stood steady, translating every word while Samuel held Clara's hands. When their son finally arrived, healthy, perfect, with Clara's dark eyes and Samuel's stubborn chin, his first sound was a cry that Clara felt through Samuel's chest as he held them both. "He's loud," Ruth observed, then signed it to Clara, who laughed through her exhaustion. They named him Thomas Samuel Hawkins, honoring the past while claiming the future. Within days, it became clear that little Tom could hear, responding to sounds with the alertness of any baby. But Clara was already signing to him, and his eyes tracked her hands with fascination. The christening brought the whole town. Mrs. Henderson, now one of Clara's staunchest supporters, had sewn the christening gown. Bob Garrett carved a wooden rattle that Tom immediately tried to eat. Even Sheriff Morrison, now married to Miss Patterson, brought a gift, a small leather-bound book for recording Tom's firsts. "First word and first sign," Morrison said with a wink. 1 year later, autumn, 1886, the expanded schoolhouse rang with controlled chaos. 32 students, 12 of them deaf, all learning together. Clara moved between them like a conductor, orchestrating education in 2 languages. Tom toddled at her feet, 18 months old and already signing milk and more along with speaking his first words. Samuel arrived with lunch, as had become his custom. The students loved when he came, begging for stories of his cavalry days that he'd tell while Clara translated. Today, though, he found Clara teaching both hearing and deaf children to sign a song, hands moving in synchronized poetry while some voices joined in. "It's Amazing Grace," Ruth explained, now 14 and Clara's official assistant. Mama figured out how to make the signs match the rhythm. Grace, 12 and fierce as ever, was leading the deaf children, her signs bold and confident. She'd announced last week that she intended to go to Gallaudet College to become a proper deaf education teacher. "Like Mama, but I'll bring what I learned back here." After school, the family walked home together, Samuel carrying Tom, who signed bird every time one flew overhead. Clara and the girls discussing the day's lessons in a mixture of signs and words. The empty rocking chair had long since been joined by a second one, and now both were filled each evening as Clara and Samuel sat watching their children play. The house was no longer quiet. It rang with life, different from before, neither better nor worse, just evolved. Mary's garden grew alongside Clara's additions. Her recipes filled the kitchen next to Clara's own. 2 mothers' wisdom guided the children. 2 love stories shaped the family's understanding of resilience. That evening, as autumn sun painted the Wyoming sky purple and gold, Clara stood in the garden where Samuel had proposed. The roses had taken after all, climbing wild and strong up the new trellis, blooming despite every prediction they wouldn't survive. Samuel joined her, Tom on his hip. The baby reached for Clara, signing Mama with chubby fingers. "He'll know," Clara signed to Samuel. "Our children will know that love speaks every language." "Every language," Samuel agreed, pulling his wife close as their daughters ran toward them, hands and voices telling of their day's adventures. The Hawkins homestead stood against the vast Wyoming sky, no longer a monument to loss, but a testament to the family that had grown from the ashes of tragedy. Inside, 2 rocking chairs waited by the fire. On the mantel, photographs of 2 remarkable women who'd mothered these children. On the table, books and slates covered with lessons in letters and signs. At dinner, Tom banged his spoon happily while Grace told a story with elaborate gestures that had them all laughing. Ruth practiced her speech for the upcoming school board meeting about expanding the deaf education program. Clara and Samuel exchanged looks of perfect understanding across the cheerful chaos, no words needed, spoken or signed. Later, as the house settled into sleep, Clara stood by Tom's crib, watching him dream. His small hands moved slightly, signing in his sleep, already bilingual in love's languages. Samuel wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood together in the quiet that was never really silence, not anymore. "No regrets," he whispered against her hair, knowing she couldn't hear but would feel the rumble of his voice. She turned in his arms, touched his face, and signed the words that had become their private ending to each day. Only gratitude, only love, only yes. Through the window, stars scattered across the prairie sky like promises kept. The autumn wind carried the scent of roses that shouldn't have bloomed but did, of bread rising for tomorrow's breakfast, of home. Ruth's journal entry, found years later, captured it best. "We learned that families aren't built from perfection, but from choosing each other daily. Papa chose Clara in the town square. Clara chose us with every lesson taught in patience. We chose her the moment we called her Mama. And Tom was born into choosing. His first breath a yes to our imperfect, perfect family. Mother Mary gave us life. Mother Clara taught us to live it fully, in sound and silence both. The empty chair that had started their story was now filled with memory and promise in equal measure. The Hawkins family was complete, not because nothing was missing, but because they'd learned to build beauty from absence, to find voice in silence, to discover that love needs no common language when hearts know how to listen. I've told you this story because I needed you to know that families aren't born from perfect circumstances. They're forged in the furnace of choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. Samuel could have turned away that day in the square, kept his daughters safe in their familiar grief. Clara could have fled after that first threat, disappeared into territory where her silence might have been less noticed. The girls could have resented this stranger who changed everything they knew about home. But gratitude has a peculiar alchemy. It transforms debt into gift, obligation into opportunity. Clara saved the Garrett boy not because she owed the town anything, but because gratitude had already rewritten her heart's language. The girls translated for her not from duty, but from the deep recognition that being heard is the first form of being loved. What strikes me most, even now, is how silence taught them to listen better. Samuel learned that love doesn't always announce itself with words. Sometimes it arrives in the patient mending of a dress, the careful tending of neglected roses, the gentle correction of a child's penmanship. The empty chair on that porch didn't fill again with the same person, but it filled with the same love, multiplied and transformed. This is what I know: we're all walking around deaf to something, unable to hear certain frequencies of grace until someone teaches us their language.